Hello, class. For the last couple of weeks, I've been talking to you about two of the major intellectual and artistic movements taking place in the 18th century in Europe, the Enlightenment and the rise of the so-called neoclassical style in art, music, and literature that came to define the late 18th through the early 19th centuries. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about Romanticism, which is the next movement in European art, music, and especially literature that begins in the early 19th century, so it sort of overlaps the latter stages of neoclassicism. It continues through the mid-19th century. Um, if you had to assign dates to it, you could say Romanticism lasts from about 1800 to around 1860. But as with any date range given in this class, you have to understand that the beginning and end points of Romanticism are extremely fuzzy. So now you have a rough idea of when Romanticism gets going in Europe. But before I can explain what Romanticism actually was, I kind of need to explain where it came from. In essence, Romanticism is a reaction to contemporaneous events in the early to mid 19th century in Europe. But it wasn't just a reaction to one thing, it was a reaction to several things going on around the same time. Uh, the first underlying factor is the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. As I've already alluded to, from 1789 to 1799, you have about a decade-long period known as the French Revolution, in which France overthrew its king and went through a series of revolutionary governments before Napoleon Bonaparte engineered a coup and rose to power in 1799, naming himself first consul of France. He would later take the title of emperor in 1804. For most of the next decade, and a half until his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was the dominant figure in European politics, and his ambition was to create a great French empire in Europe. Um, that ambition led to a series of wars called the Napoleonic Wars, leaving behind a huge body count, estimated at somewhere around 3.5 to 6.5 million people across Europe. Um, and of course, that leads to a lot of anti-French sentiment. All of Europe was scarred by the Napoleonic Wars. They were particularly devastating to Germany. Most of the German states were reorganized under French leadership into the so-called Confederation of the Rhine, which took marching orders directly from Napoleon. The main anti-Napoleonic state in Germany, Prussia, was broken up and dismembered, and nearly all of Germany had been subjugated to occupation and control by French troops to one degree or another. So many Germans in particular reacted to Napoleon by rejecting anything and everything that smacked of French culture or identity. And what else, um, besides Napoleon himself, smacked of French culture and identity? Why? The Enlightenment, of course. In many ways, the French Revolution had grown out of the Enlightenment. Um, the French revolutionaries and later Napoleon himself often claimed to be acting on behalf of such Enlightenment ideals as reason, liberty, equality, and faith in progress. In Germany, in the 19th century, many artists and writers reacted against the Enlightenment emphasis on rationality and progress by stressing it's the opposite in their work: passion, emotion, nostalgia, and mysticism. Another factor that contributed to the rise of Romanticism was the Industrial Revolution. Romanticists often connected industrialization with the Enlightenment because of their shared emphasis on reason and science. The Industrial Revolution started in Britain in the mid to late 18th century, but by the early 19th century it had spread south into most of Western Europe. Over time, industrialization would bring all kinds of benefits: rising wages, lots of new jobs, cheap manufactured goods that made everybody's life easier. But In its early stages, it also had a lot of negative consequences on which Romantic artists and writers focused heavily. Uh, One was pollution. The early stages of the Industrial Revolution were powered by coal, a relatively dirty fuel. It led to contaminated rivers and streams, poor air quality, etc. Romanticists focused on those things. They also reacted to the contamination they associated with Industrial Revolution by glorifying nature. Labor strife. Um, was another factor in their reaction against the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution led to a lot of labor strife between management and workers. Romantic artists and writers tended to play this up, suggesting that industry was causing chaos by breaking down the social bonds that had tied people together for so long. Um, and lastly, the Industrial Revolution was both driven by and also responsible for a lot of new technologies. Who could be against that, right? Today, we have a very positive view of technology on the whole, but romanticists were deeply skeptical about technology. They didn't believe technology was always a good thing. Yes, technology gives us great benefits, but it comes at great costs. It destroys jobs, it destroys the environment, and in the long run, it threatens to warp and destroy the things that make us human. So, an example of this romantic reaction against technology is Mary Shelley's famous novel Frankenstein, which depicts a mad scientist who embarks on a quest to create a human being, owing to his conviction that through science, human beings had learned how to, quote, penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, unquote. Of course, much to his regret, by the end of this novel, the scientist learned that his quest for godlike powers had gone awry, and what he had created was not so much a man at all, but rather a monster, which eventually turned on him. Another factor leading to the rise of Romanticism, one intricately connected to industrialization, was urbanization. Urbanization. Uh, Remember that the Industrial Revolution began in Britain in the mid 18th century. So by the time Romanticism shows up in Britain in the early 19th century, industrialization had already been underway there for about a half century. It had already altered the social fabric of the country. One big change was that a bunch of people had moved to the cities to find work in the booming factories there. Over time, this does lead to some benefits: better wages, more comfortable living conditions, social mobility, etc. But it also came at a cost, which Romantic artists, writers, and especially poets focused on in their work. The cities are often depicted as dark, dirty, dangerous places full of crime, disease, and injustice of every kind. The poet William Blake, for example, depicted the city of London as a festering sewer full of every kind of social inequity. One example is his famous poem, The Chimney Sweeper, which shines a light on the problem of child labor in big industrial cities. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry, weep, weep, weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. There's little Tom Dacker, who cried when his head, that curled like a lamb's back, was shaved. So I said, hush, Tom, never mind it, for when your head's bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. Um, just as the Romantics tended to fixate upon crime, vice, and filth in the cities, they also tended to idealize nature and the simplicities and the charms and the virtues of rural life. But more on that in a bit.